Every town has a dark side. From the outside, everything looks ordinary. Quiet streets, neighbors walking their dogs, kids riding their bikes, life moving forward the way it always does. But sometimes, behind that normal life, something dangerous is growing. And the scariest part, no one sees it coming. The man in this story may be one of the most prolific serial killers America has ever known. Yet his name isn't mentioned alongside Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, or Jeffrey Dahmer. There are no major movies about him, no endless debates online, no widespread public recognition. And that's what makes this case even more disturbing. Because despite warning signs, despite arrests, despite psychiatric evaluations that clearly labeled him dangerous, the system kept letting him go. Today, we're heading to Michigan to uncover the chilling story of Carl Eugene Watts, the man later known as the Sunday morning slasher. And once you hear what happened, you'll understand why this case stays with people long after they learn about it. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7, 1953, in Killeen, Texas. His early life, at least on the surface, didn't seem unusual. His father was a strict Army private, disciplined, quiet, and serious. His mother, Dorothy, was his complete opposite. She worked as a kindergarten art teacher, spending her days surrounded by finger paints, paper crafts, and the joyful chaos of young children. But when Carl was just 2 years old, his parents separated. Dorothy packed up what she could and moved north to Inkster, Michigan, a working-class suburb just outside Detroit. There, she started over. She eventually remarried a mechanic named Norman Caesar, and together they built what appeared to be a stable home. Carl grew up alongside 2 younger sisters. From the outside, everything looked normal, a steady household. Parents who worked, kids who went to school. Nothing about the family stood out. Nothing that would suggest something dark was slowly developing. But when Carl was 8 years old, something happened that his family would later point to again and again. The moment they believed everything changed. He contracted meningitis. At the time, the illness was extremely serious and often fatal. Carl's case was severe. His fever climbed dangerously high, and doctors worried about permanent brain damage. He underwent painful spinal taps and remained isolated in the hospital for weeks. One of his younger sisters also became sick around the same time. She recovered quickly. Carl didn't. When he finally returned home, his family noticed the difference immediately. The outgoing, talkative child they remembered was gone. In his place was someone quiet, withdrawn, distant. It was as if part of his personality had never come back from that hospital room. School became difficult. His grades dropped. He struggled to focus and eventually had to repeat a grade. But the academic problems weren't the most troubling change. Around this time, Carl began experiencing violent dreams. At least that's what others would call them. To Carl, they weren't nightmares. He told doctors that he dreamed about fighting what he described as evil women. In his mind, these women weren't people. They were dark forces, enemies he needed to destroy. The disturbing part wasn't the content of the dreams. It was how they made him feel. When he woke up, he didn't feel afraid. He didn't feel disturbed. He felt calm, relieved, even satisfied, and the dreams didn't stop. By the time Carl was 12 years old, the fantasies had begun to follow him into his waking life. He would replay the scenes in his mind over and over again. Around that same time, his behavior started to escalate. He began following girls in his neighborhood, watching them, learning their routines, keeping track of where they lived and when they were alone. For nearly 3 years, he observed and imagined, and eventually imagination wasn't enough. On June 29, 1969, Carl Watts was 15 years old and working a paper route. That morning, he approached the home of a 26-year-old woman, When she opened the door, he attacked her without warning. He beat her, kicked her, overpowered her completely. Then suddenly he stopped. He turned around and walked away. As if nothing had happened, the victim called police immediately. Officers went to the Watts home and took Carl into custody. Given the nature of the attack, he was sent to the Lafayette Clinic, psychiatric hospital, in Detroit for evaluation. What doctors discovered was deeply concerning. Carl's IQ tested at 75, just above the threshold for intellectual disability at the time. They also observed paranoid thinking patterns and violent impulses. When asked why he attacked the woman, his response was chilling in its simplicity. "I just felt like beating somebody." One psychiatrist wrote in his notes that Carl Watts was a paranoid young man struggling to control strong homicidal urges and posed a serious threat to society. It was a clear warning, but despite that assessment, Carl was released on his 16th birthday. He was instructed to attend outpatient therapy. He barely showed up. Against the odds, Watts graduated from high school in 1973. He was 19 years old. His grades were poor, and he had a reputation for drug use. But he was athletic and talented enough to earn a football scholarship to Lane College in Tennessee. It seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start. It lasted 3 months. Multiple female students reported that Watts had been stalking them. Some said he had physically attacked them. The school expelled him. That same year, a female student on campus was stabbed to death. Many students believed Watts was responsible, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. Once again, he walked away. After leaving Tennessee, Watts drifted between cities before eventually returning to Michigan. In the fall of 1974, he enrolled at Western Michigan University. For a brief moment, it appeared he was trying to build a normal life, but the violence returned almost immediately. On October 25, a woman answered her apartment door to a man asking for someone named Charles. When she unlatched the chain, he forced his way inside and began choking her. She lost consciousness. 5 days later, another woman in the same apartment complex was found dead, stabbed 33 times. Weeks after that, yet another woman answered her door to a man asking for Charles. Same approach, same pattern. This time she fought back and survived. As the attacker fled, she saw his car, a tan Pontiac Grand Prix. Both surviving victims later identified Carl Watts in a police lineup. He was arrested. During questioning, he admitted to attacking around 15 women. But he denied the murder. Psychiatrists once again evaluated him and diagnosed antisocial personality disorder. They warned that he was extremely dangerous and likely to hurt people again. Watts pleaded no contest to assault charges. He served 1 year in jail. Then, in 1976, he was released. The murder case never moved forward. There wasn't enough evidence. After his release, Watts returned home to Inkster and moved back in with his mother and stepfather. In 1979, he fathered a child with a childhood acquaintance. The relationship ended quickly. Not long after, he married a woman named Valeria Goodwill. The marriage was short and deeply unsettling. Valeria later described his behavior as strange and disturbing. He would rearrange furniture compulsively, destroy houseplants with knives, melt candles directly onto tables, scatter trash across the floor, and leave it there. The marriage lasted 6 months. What she didn't know by that time, Carl Watts had already started killing. On October 31, 1979, a 44-year-old woman was walking home from a doctor's appointment in a quiet Detroit suburb. It was the middle of the day. She was attacked on the sidewalk and stabbed repeatedly with what investigators believed was a screwdriver. She died where she fell. Police had no suspects, no witnesses, no clear motive, and no idea that something far worse was coming. In early 1980, Watts moved to Ann Arbor. That's when the violence escalated dramatically. A 17-year-old girl was stabbed near her home. A 26-year-old woman was attacked outside her apartment. A graduate student at the University of Michigan was found just steps from her door, suffering from nearly 50 stab wounds. The pattern was becoming clear. Early morning hours near the victim's home. No robbery, no sexual assault. Just sudden, explosive violence, and then silence. No clues, no witnesses, no suspect. By this point, a predator was moving through the area, fast, unpredictable, and completely out of control. And the worst part? Authorities still had no idea just how many chances they'd already had to stop him. By this point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The attacks were happening early in the morning, almost always on Sundays, always near the victims' homes, and the violence was sudden, explosive, and deeply personal. The local newspaper in Ann Arbor gave the unknown killer a name that would soon spread fear across the region: the Sunday morning slasher. Investigators noticed the similarities immediately: the timing, the wound patterns, the spacing between attacks. It was clear they weren't dealing with random violence anymore. They were dealing with a serial killer. Police formed a special task force led by Detective Paul Button, but despite the urgency, they had almost nothing to work with. No reliable witnesses, no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no weapon, and perhaps most troubling of all, no clear motive. The victims came from different backgrounds, different races, different ages. Some were teenagers, others were women in their 40s. The only things they had in common were simple and terrifying. They were women, and they were alone in the early morning hours. Then Detective Button received a call that would change the direction of the investigation. A sergeant from Kalamazoo, the same area where a series of assaults had occurred years earlier, believed the cases might be connected. Button began digging into a name from those earlier investigations: Carl Eugene Watts. At the time, Watts didn't look like a monster. He was working for his stepfather's trucking business. He had been married, divorced, living a quiet, ordinary life. On paper, he looked like just another struggling man trying to get by, but Button wasn't convinced. In October 1980, investigators received another alarming development. Police in Windsor, Ontario, just across the border from Detroit, had been dealing with a series of violent attacks. Women were being slashed and stabbed. Most survived, barely. When Button reviewed border records, he noticed something chilling. Carl Watts' car had crossed into Windsor multiple times, and almost every time it did, an attack followed. One survivor later identified Watts in a photo lineup, though she wasn't completely certain. Still, the pattern was growing harder to ignore. Then came the break investigators had been waiting for. On November 15, 1980, 2 patrol officers in Ann Arbor spotted a brown Pontiac Grand Prix driving slowly behind a female student walking home. The woman noticed the car too and quickly ducked into a doorway. The officers pulled the vehicle over. The driver's license was expired. The registration was outdated. The driver was Carl Watts. When officers searched the car, they found tools, screwdrivers, files, and other sharp instruments. Then they discovered something even more disturbing: a book with a name carved into the cover: Rebecca Huff, a graduate student who had been stabbed more than 50 times just weeks earlier. It still wasn't enough evidence to charge him with murder. But from that moment on, Carl Watts became their primary suspect. Police placed him under constant surveillance. They installed a tracking device in his car and followed him everywhere. What they observed was deeply unsettling. Watts would drive for hours, sometimes hundreds of miles in a single night. He circled neighborhoods slowly, cruised quiet streets, watched people walking alone. He wasn't commuting, he was hunting. Eventually, it became clear that Watts knew he was being watched. And suddenly, the murders in Michigan stopped. In the spring of 1981, Watts made a major move. He quit his job, packed up and relocated to Texas, settling outside Houston. Detective Button immediately contacted Houston authorities. He sent everything: Watts' history, photographs, vehicle information, and a clear warning. Carl Watts was a dangerous predator. He needed to be watched. But Houston in 1981 was overwhelmed. The city had one of the highest murder rates in the country. Police were understaffed, underfunded, and buried in violent crime. The warning from Michigan was filed away and largely ignored. Watts found work as a mechanic. During the week, he lived quietly, but on weekends, he drove into the city. And he began killing again. The attacks came fast, and they came often. A woman was found drowned in her apartment pool, initially ruled an accident. Days later, another woman was stabbed while walking her dog. Hours after that, a second victim was attacked while carrying groceries inside. Both died just steps from their front doors. In early 1982, the violence escalated even further. A woman was found hanging from a tree near a university. Authorities initially believed it was suicide. Later, Watts would admit he staged the scene just to see how police would react. Another victim was found in the trunk of her car, her throat crushed. A woman changing a flat tire was attacked and left for dead, but survived. A young woman disappeared on her way to a new job. Her body wasn't found for 5 months. The killings continued. Strangulations, stabbings, bodies left in ditches, dumpsters, and abandoned areas. Sometimes he attacked multiple victims in a single day. The level of violence was escalating, and the frequency suggested a man completely out of control. Then, in May 1982, everything finally caught up with him. Early one morning, Watts attacked a woman outside her apartment and dragged her inside. When her roommate arrived, he attacked her too. One of the women pretended to be unconscious. Watts tied her hands and became visibly excited, clapping and jumping, as he prepared for what he thought would be his next attack. But while his attention was elsewhere, she managed to free herself. She ran to the balcony, jumped from the second floor, and screamed for help. A neighbor rushed inside and pulled the other victim from a filling bathtub just in time. Police arrived within minutes. Carl Watts was arrested as he tried to flee. Investigators quickly realized who they had. But there was a problem. Despite the number of victims, there was almost no physical evidence linking him to the murders. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no forensic proof. Prosecutors feared that if they tried him for murder, he might walk free. So they made a controversial decision. They offered him a deal. If Watts confessed to the unsolved murders and showed investigators where the bodies were buried, he would receive immunity for those killings. In exchange, he would plead guilty to burglary with intent to commit murder and receive a 60-year sentence. At the time, it seemed like a safe decision. Watts was only 29. 60 years meant he would likely die in prison. He accepted. Over the next week, Watts confessed to 13 murders in detail, 12 in Texas, 1 in Michigan. He led investigators to burial sites, explained how he selected victims, described the weapons he used, and throughout the interviews, he showed no remorse. When asked why he did it, he gave the same explanation he had hinted at since childhood. He believed the women had evil in their eyes, and that killing them was a way to free their spirits. He later suggested the real number of victims might be far higher, 40, then 80. Eventually, he claimed he had stopped counting. Some investigators believe the true total could exceed 100. In September 1982, Watts was sentenced to 60 years in prison. It seemed the case was finally over, but it wasn't. Years later, a legal technicality changed everything. Because of an error in how the plea agreement was handled, Watts' conviction was reclassified as non-violent under Texas law. That meant he could earn significant reductions for good behavior, and he did. He became a model prisoner. His sentence was quietly reduced year by year. By 2006, Carl Watts, a man who had confessed to multiple murders, was scheduled for release. He would have served only 24 years. Back in Michigan, prosecutors raced to stop it, because the immunity deal only applied in Texas. If they could tie him to a Michigan murder, they could keep him locked away. Investigators reopened hundreds of cold cases. Then a witness came forward, a man who, decades earlier, had seen a woman being attacked in an alley. He never forgot the face. That face was Carl Watts. In 2004, Watts was charged with murder in Michigan. He was convicted and sentenced to life without parole, then charged again for another killing, another conviction, another life sentence. Justice finally seemed permanent, but the story didn't end there. In September 2007, Carl Eugene Watts died in a prison hospital from prostate cancer. He was 53 years old. He never fully confessed to everything he had done, and because of that, the true number of his victims may never be known. Some investigators believe he may have been one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, a man who killed for decades, a man the system failed to stop again and again, a man who nearly walked free, and a man whose name most people have never heard.